And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardent, Oklahoma. And over here is my good friend William Bell, sitting in Memphis, Tennessee. Just before coming on the air, I asked William what the weather was like over there, and he said it wasn't bad at all. Well, here in southern Oklahoma, William, there on I-35, just the other side of the Arbuckle Mountains, you're familiar with that. Uh, the highway, Interstate 35, is completely closed. A good friend of mine sent me a video just a few moments ago of the traffic just sitting there. Snow is coming down like crazy, ice all over the road, all this kind of stuff like that. It's currently, let me see, it's currently 16 degrees here
Ooh,
where I'm at. Yeah, and they claim tonight we're supposed now whether or not it does, I don't know. Who knows? They miss their forecast for us so many times, but they claim that we're supposed to hit about 9 degrees this tonight.
mm.
So yeah, nice and balmy.
Yeah, right. Um, I have checked the weather forecast for Memphis, and but right now it's 35 degrees Fahrenheit. But they do say there is a winter storm warning, so it
Yeah.
could get yeah worse. And I
Well,
did hear that bad weather was coming in.
yeah. Well, they claim this entire weekend is supposed to be really, really nasty, which
Hmm
is going to knock me out of going to a swap meet.
Uh,
One of my very favorite swap meets of the years. It's in Decatur, Texas, about 90 miles south and west of me. But Thursday morning, they're claiming about 10 to 12 degrees with a high of about 21. Well, I may be a diehard swap meet guy. I'm sorry, I ain't walking around in 20-degree weather.
well, it's supposed to get down to 16 tonight,
Yeah.
and tomorrow. Whoa, they're saying 8 degrees.
Oh, there you go. It's headed your way.
Yeah, yeah. And
Wow.
but it rises the rest of the week. It goes from 13 and then in the 20s, 30s, and up to the 40s. I don't know if you heard, Dunn. Joy passed. Did you know that?
No, I did not.
Yeah, last Saturday, actually. I'm sorry I didn't tell you.
Oh my.
But yeah,
No. What a wonderful lady.
yeah,
Uh,
she was.
what happened, if
And
I could ask?
well, she had been ill for some time, and she had had two kidney transplants in her life
Uh,
and did well with them all the time. But as I would say, within say a couple of years ago, she started to get a little bit feeble. Her memory, start dealing with memory loss and things like
uh,
that. And so we would have to pick her up and take her to service, on Sunday mornings when she could come, and then sometimes she couldn't. And then eventually she got, she was just homebound. She broke her hip prior to this
mm.
and had to stay in the hospital for that. And then when she came home, um, she had recovered, pretty much from that, but she still wasn't able to get about, as she was. And then she just kind of went down, and they downgraded her to like hospice. And I would say within a week or two after that, she passed away.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very, very sad. Like I said,
Yeah.
very, very, very wonderful lady, very sweet lady. Thought a lot of her. So
Yeah. She was in a large way, her and her mother, influential in my ministry.
yeah, very
Um,
supportive of you down through the many
oh,
years.
yeah. Yeah. Aaron Toller's mother passed as well.
Uh,
Yeah. So
well, well, that's part of
just the
life.
way of the
That's
world, right?
it's the way of the world. We weren't intended to stay here.
That's right.
And I was talking to somebody about it. One of my car guys, a little swap meet I went to a week and a half ago, and I don't know him real well, but
Hmm
he was sharing with me that some of his friends had passed, and Jan's brother had passed suddenly, and of course he knows I'm a minister and what have you. And I said, well, Troy, I said that's just the way of our life here. I said, we're guaranteed not to get out of this world alive. That's
That's
just
right.
all that's just all there is to it. I said, the best thing that we can do is prepare to leave. And he kind of stood there very thoughtful for a minute. And he said, well, yeah, you're exactly right. He said, it's best that we take care of things and make sure that we go the right way and go the right direction. So, I mean, it is. It's painful, but it's part of this life. And, I very commonly think of Psalms 116, verse 15,
Hmm.
and what a tremendous contrast. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Precious in the sight of the Lord, excuse me,
Is the
is
death of its saints.
is the death of the saints. I mean, words, and that was even under the old covenant, where their understanding was so limited, and what have you. And we have the perfect assurance now because of the resurrection of Christ of knowing. It's kind of like Jesus said in John chapter 11, if a man keep my saying, he shall never die. And I mean, we all know we're going to die biologically.
Hmm.
That's just all there is to it. But the reality is that if we belong to Christ, we don't ever die. We don't
Hmm.
ever go out of existence. We become one, truly one. And that kind of faith can sustain us no matter what in this life. I mean, that's just all there is to it.
Yeah, I was talking to someone, I think about a week ago. They were down in the dumps, depressed, and feeling like their life was useless and worthless. And I just encouraged them with that very passage and a couple of others. And, they just turned their life around. Some people, I remember back years ago, when I was younger, um, taking these passages and even getting other books and reading them in order to, help to give me some strength. Um, and especially with what, you and I went through, there were times when we needed some encouragement, but I was always able to encourage myself for the most part. And so I would read, and, I had my favorite scriptures that I would always turn to and use them, like Philippians 4,
Yeah,
6 and 7, and 1 Peter 5, 7, Matthew 6, and all of those, and so I would use them. But sometimes it amazes me that people don't avail themselves to all these rich treasures of encouragement that are found in the scriptures. And if we just read them and meditated upon them and really, reflected, they'll take you out of the dumps and give you some inspiration to live and to, realize that your life is worth something so that you can be effective in the world.
absolutely. I well remember when my father passed away suddenly. Um, I personally had no idea that his heart was bad. I think
Hmm.
my mom knew more than she let on, and certainly more than he did because he never talked about it. But anyway,
Hmm.
he passed away suddenly, and he was 62 years old. And anymore that seems awfully young. I mean, that's a long time ago for me. And
Yeah, me
I,
too.
in fact, I told someone the other day, I said, I have to tell you that as I was coming up on my 62nd birthday, I approached it with a certain degree of trepidation. It's like, well, okay, he passed at 62. Am I going to make it? And here I am, 75 now. And anyway, I remember so vividly that, and I don't think I could do this today, William, because the older I get, the more emotional I get.
Hmm.
And I think that's just part of growing older. But the day after he passed away, I preached at a congregation called at Winslow, Oklahoma, where my dad had preached many years before. He had stood in that very pulpit.
Hmm.
And I really gave a eulogy, and I drew on some of these very passages that you and I are talking about. Um, to me, Philippians chapter 1 is such an incredibly powerful text in which Paul said, I have a desire to depart and be with Christ. And he says, which from one perspective, he said, is far better, and that was far better than human relations,
Hmm.
far better than his relationship with the church, far better than any family relationships. And he just said, but I do know it's better for me to stay and to be with you, but to depart and to be with Christ is far better.
Hmm.
And that has been, I mean, it's such a short statement, and yet it's so full of richness and so full of power. I mean, here he is. He is a man that is loved and vilified. He is a man with tremendous empire-wide influence. And yet he said, I really honestly, he said, I'd like to depart and to be with Christ. That intimacy of that relationship, which we can enjoy because of Christ's resurrection, and the assurance that it gives us, lets us truly see that silver lining to any dark cloud that comes our way. It's just there's I think about what Paul said. I wouldn't have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, but you do not sorrow as others who have no
No.
hope. Well, we don't have hope, we have assurance. And that's just all, that's everything. That is absolutely everything. So anyway,
Yeah.
give my condolences and love to Joy's family, if you would. I'd appreciate it.
All right. I will do that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we want to come back tonight to Hebrews chapter 9, 6 through 10. We read it last week. I won't take the time to do that again tonight. But as I mentioned last week, this passage seems to me almost, I mean, I know it's not the center point of Hebrews, but it is to me one of the most crucial eschatological passages that could possibly be imagined. In a book that is speaking about what is better, 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 better about Christ as opposed to the old covenant, he tells us and gives us the reasons why. So last week we talked about some of the highlights. Among those being, he said, the Holy Spirit is indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all is not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle is present active, still standing, not physically standing, but having legal standing. And he says that old covenant system was imposed from the Greek word epikaiomai until the time of Reformation. Now, William, I want you to comment on what I'm about to say and to see, critically assess it to see if it is what this text is actually saying. As long as the old covenant stood, there was no forgiveness of sin. Is that true or false?
That's true.
All right. As long as there was no forgiveness of sin, there was no entrance into the most holy place, that is to say, heaven itself.
That's true.
Okay. And that old covenant system would stand valid and imposed until, I will word this slightly different, until the time when man would have forgiveness and man could enter the most holy place.
That's true.
Okay. So if those things are true, and I absolutely agree, they are true, then when someone says, of those from our background, our Church of Christ, our millennial background, when they tell us when we die as Christians, we don't get to go to heaven, what are they implicitly saying?
They're saying that we are still under the old law, that the temple is still standing and or has a standing. I don't even know if they've thought that through that much.
No.
And that Hades is still in existence. And of course, that all things are not fulfilled. And of course, they're still in that time uh, leading up to the consummation. And so they're in this pre-parousia period or reign of Christ from the standpoint of their understanding of Scripture.
And to
And
me,
and no
well,
forgiveness. Yeah,
yeah, that to me is what I was going to focus on. That means we are not forgiven. You know, I asked one person one time, they were challenging me quite vehemently. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. Is it the physical body that keeps men out of heaven? And they were like, well, no. I said, well, okay, is it being in a spirit form? Is it being in, without a body, but in a spirit? Is that what keeps us out of heaven? No. And I go, what are you talking about? I said, well, I'm just trying to get to a point here. I said, please explain to me what is the one thing that keeps us out of heaven? And they stood there kind of almost perplexed for a moment. And they said, well, it's sin. I said, bingo. I said, that's my point. That's the point of Hebrews chapter 9. The one thing, the only thing that would prevent men from going to heaven was sin. And the problem with sin was it could never be forgiven under the old law. The blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. Now, William, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. And 2 years ago, I think it was, have a terrible time remembering time, but on Facebook, a former preterist and several of his cronies, I'll use that term with levity, um, just, oh man, they just attacked me coming and going and said it is an abomination to say they did not have forgiveness of sin under the old covenant. Blessed is the man whose sins are not forgiven, and blessed is the man to whom God will not impute unrighteousness, and other passages that they quoted. So, what did we do, William, with all of those Old Testament passages which talk about forgiveness seemingly being a reality, and yet then we come to the New Testament that tells us no, there was no forgiveness under the old law. So how do we balance this?
Uh, we would balance it by first of all, understanding, as you said before, that it was not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sin. So we can't leave that hanging out there and claim that it could when the scriptures tell us plainly that it couldn't. The other aspect of that is that those sins were remembered every year, which required the high priest to go in every year and make an atonement. So as long as that process continued, that indicated that there was no completeness of forgiveness, and because Jesus hadn't died to shed his blood, which would be the means by which forgiveness would come. And when you look at other scriptures, they would point out that Christ's blood was shed for sins that had been done in the past. There would have been no need to do that from that perspective. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, I think the passage you alluded to, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15, that Christ became the mediator of a new covenant for the remission of the sins that were past.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't die just for sins that would be committed after him. His blood, as I heard countless Church of Christ preachers say, his blood flowed both ways.
Right.
Okay, and that's true. And whether or not Zechariah chapter 14 actually addresses that, when it talks about a fountain for cleansing being opened in Jerusalem, which would be the New Jerusalem, some would flow to the former sea, and some would flow to the former and hinder. I'm not positive that refers to the blood flowing both ways, but I don't have a problem with it. But the point is that he died for the remission of the sins committed under the first covenant. And like you were pointing out there, if they had forgiveness, then why did he have to die for forgiveness of those sins that were committed under that old covenant? That just simply makes no sense at all. Another argument that was given to me, William, pardon me, was, well, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are currently sitting at the Messianic banquet in fulfillment of Matthew chapter 8:11. Many shall come from the east and the west and shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom. And as let me see, I think it's the New Revised Translation says, while the sons of the kingdom are cast out. In other words, there's a synchronicity with those righteous sitting down in the kingdom and the unrighteous, the sons of the old covenant kingdom, being cast out. But this individual and others were pointing out to me, well, what that passage means that Abraham was already in the kingdom. He was already at the banquet in heaven. Well, let me ask you a question here, William. When would the Messianic banquet of Matthew chapter 8:11 be established?
Well, according to the text that you just cited from Matthew chapter 8, as you talked about that synchronicity, it's established when all the enemies were defeated. But according to Matthew 8, and those are the enemies that are mentioned in that text.
Yep.
Because he says, when you yourselves are cast out. So when the Jews were cast out, and you have the same thing in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 30 with cast out the bondwoman and her son. You have a similar text in Matthew 21. The kingdom of God should be taken from you. So all of those passages indicate the very time of the defeat of Jesus's enemies, the Jews being cast out, the national kingdom, those who rebelled against the Messiah. That's the point and time when the Messianic banquet was served. And of course, in Revelation 19, you have it at the time when Jerusalem, the harlot, is judged.
All of that is absolutely true. It's not what I had in mind.
Okay.
In Isaiah
Oh,
chapter 25.
Yep, that's another one.
Yep, the Messianic resurrection banquet, we'll call it that. The Lord said, on this mountain, that's in Mount Zion, the Lord shall prepare a great feast, a feast of wine on the leaves, a feast of fat things. On Zion. And as you and I don't even remember how long our study was, but you and I had an extensive, in-depth study of the word Zion and its eschatological and soteriological implications and applications. Zion is the locus and the focus of resurrection life, of salvation life. So here is Isaiah 25 talking about the Messianic banquet. Verse 8, it would be, in that day, the Lord shall swallow up death in victory. He shall destroy the covering or remove the covering, the veil that is cast over all the nations. So the point that I was getting at, in addition to the excellent ones that you presented, was the Messianic banquet would be established in the day of the resurrection on Mount Zion. Well, wait a minute. Isaiah 25:8 is quoted by Paul, as you know, in 1 Corinthians 15, 55, and 56, when the mortal would put on immortality, when the corruptible would put on incorruptibility, then shall be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. That's directly from Isaiah 25. So here's my point, folks. And by the way, I got to tell you something. This is a little bit of a digression. William Bell is responsible for turning my head around on my shoulders years and years ago. He wrote a little, it was almost a little pamphlet addressing one of the preachers there in Memphis, as I remember it. Anyway, you had like a paragraph and a half, maybe, on Matthew chapter 8:11. Do you remember that?
Yes.
All right. I read that and my head exploded about the significance of Matthew chapter 8. And folks, in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, I have an extensive discussion of the significance of Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. But here's the point. Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 is based upon, and virtually all scholars agree with this, based upon Isaiah 25:6. But that means it's 6 through 8. Because Paul applies Isaiah 25:8 to the resurrection, the end time resurrection. We are told that the end time resurrection is when all of the dead who have ever died are revived, reconstituted, raised, resurrected, right?
That's correct.
Okay. That resurrection would be at the time of the Messianic banquet. But wait a minute. It's really fascinating to me, William. I know you're aware of this. Commentator after commentator after commentary, especially in the amillennial and in the postmillennial world, say, oh, yeah, the Messianic banquet is set. We enjoy that now. That's salvation for us today. We sit at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Oh, wait a minute. If we are sitting at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, 20, 55 and 56 has occurred. I'm pretty sure, William, nobody has seen Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sit down at a banquet and gathered there with them in their raised biological bodies. And yet, if we are at the table with them today, then the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 has taken place. Is that valid, or can you find a hole in that?
No, that's absolutely valid. It makes a great point. And it also shows, look at the correlation between that as we're dealing with Hebrews. And we're talking about the end of that old covenant. We're talking about the way into the holiest of all, or the most holy place, which is behind the veil, right? That's where we have the presence behind the veil. So that's tabernacle language.
Absolutely.
And that's what you have in Isaiah 25. So we're talking about the very same event. And so that idea of putting on immortality and putting on corruption in 1 Corinthians 15 ties back into 2 Corinthians 5 as well, where he talks about temple typology. And it just shows you that all of these passages are in harmony. And it really, violates the context to force them into an individual physical body concept when the writer is dealing with this issue of access into the most holy, of forgiving sin, and putting away death, doing away with death in Mount Zion. And that's key in understanding it.
Yeah, and I have said this for many years, and we said this and we emphasized this in our lengthy discussion of Zion. I don't know of a more powerful passage in regard to Zion and resurrection than Hebrews chapter 12, 18 and following. Here's the writer. Yeah, I knew you were. But here is the writer saying, you have not come to a mountain that could not be touched. And if so much of an animal touched that mountain, it was to be thrust through with a spear. You have come to Mount Zion. And some translations, not a lot of them, but the Greek of the text supports it. And that is, you have gathered there in a festal assembly. In other words, they are there, and I talk about this in my book, Resurrection Feast Sukkot, or Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, excuse me. The writer of Hebrews is saying, you are there to celebrate Sukkot, the ultimate fulfillment of Sukkot. Well, they weren't there physically. I'm real sure the writer of Hebrews was not writing to a group of people who were literally physically gathered around the Mount Zion in Jerusalem. No, he goes ahead to say, you have come to the heavenly Jerusalem. So this entire scheme, if you please, pardon me, in spite of freezing weather, I'm still suffering with my allergies. Goodness gracious. But all of these themes, they flow so beautifully and so harmoniously together. And I want to get back to that issue, William, that we talked about a moment ago, in which people claim that, well, yeah, those, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were already sitting at the table. Well, that's saying they were already resurrected. You don't get to eat at the table unless you're resurrected. That's just the reality of it.
Right.
Okay. And we come to Hebrews chapter 11, 39 and 40, William, and I use this in my conversation with these individuals. After speaking of the great men and women of faith, who because of their faith suffered tremendous things, the writer of Hebrews says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises. Well, if the promise was the heavenly city and the heavenly country and the better resurrection, okay, then they had not, at the time Hebrews was writing, they had not received it. But the writer doesn't stop there. And he says, they, without us, could not be made perfect. So it seems to me, William, that when people say, oh, yeah, Abraham went to heaven when he died, and Isaac and Jacob and all the great men and women of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, they're just flat out denying what Hebrews has to say. And without realizing it, they're saying the resurrection had occurred. You can't, I want to reemphasize this. You can't have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sitting down at the banquet table in the kingdom without affirming they're resurrected. It's just not possible. There's another element of this. In Hebrews chapter 6, the writer speaks of Christ, and I will begin reading with verse 16. Men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for men, an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, he confirmed it with an oath, that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, but sure and steadfast, which enters into that which is within the veil, where the forerunner, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Well, William, if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob went to heaven before Christ went to heaven, weren't they the forerunners?
They would have to be the forerunners.
Huh. Well, the word forerunner is from the Greek word prodromos, and it means the one who goes before. It's a compound word. And yet, here we have people saying, oh no, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they went into heaven before Jesus ever did after his death.
And what would they be going in with?
Yeah. The blood of bulls and goats, that's it. Because that's all they had.
Mm.
So we talk about from time to time of how people get so fixated in some kind of a desire to overcome covenant eschatology that they make irrational, illogical, and certainly unbiblical arguments, like saying, oh no, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob went into heaven before Jesus ever died. Then what was the purpose of Christ's death? Is that not a valid question?
Oh, yes. Definitely. It's one that we ask all the time.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go back to Hebrews chapter 9 then, and let's pick up another element of this, because the writer says that that old covenant system would stand valid, imposed, and folks, it's difficult to overemphasize the significance of the meaning of those two words. Stasen meaning valid, and imposed meaning legally imposed. William, you and I have heard for years and years and years, you cannot have two systems existing at the same time. Yet here's the writer writing to those who are new covenant Christians. They are children of the seed, or the seed of the promise, I should say. And they're in constant combat with the children of the flesh. And they're living in the same house, according to Paul's allegory in Galatians chapter 4. But the question has to be asked about this. I got to tell you this. Just this last week, in correspondence on Facebook, and I told somebody I'm going to have to stop spending so much time on Facebook. I'm spending 3 or 4 hours a day minimum on there answering all the critics, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth.
And they're not going to change. Most of
And
them.
most of them are not. I'm just, and yet at the same time, I know that there are people auditing the discussions and,
Yes.
trying to learn, and I feel an obligation to them. And yet it's so frustrating when you're dealing with people who they're nothing but adversaries. That's all in the world you can say about them. As you said, they have no intention of changing. They will not listen, no matter how logical, no matter how textual, no matter how contextual the argument is that you make. It's always yeah, but So a guy accused me just today of something that was so irrational, so off the wall, so unrelated to what I had written. I said, that's not even close to what I said. And he writes back and he said, well, that's what I got out of it. I said, go back and read it again. I didn't say anything even closely resembling what you said. In fact, I said, you're either ignorant of what I actually said, or you're purposely distorting what I said. Which is it? And I've asked him that because he's done this over and over and over again, just blatantly misrepresenting what I had to say. And so when I asked him, did you not understand what I said, or are you purposely misrepresenting? Which is it? And he will not answer. So I suspect he knows what he's doing. And so, like I said, that's really, really frustrating. So in this discussion of whether or not people were forgiven under the old covenant, or whether or not the old covenant continued valid and imposed at the same time that the gospel had come into effect. You've heard this. I've heard this a million times. Oh, well, you're saying Christians were under two laws at the same time. Is that what we're saying?
Oh, that's a question for me. Are
Yeah,
we
that's a
saying that
question.
well, yeah, I mean, there were two laws totally in existence. However, they were dying to the one and coming alive under the other. Um, I'll tell you a passage that's really an interesting one to ask when that comes up is to go to a text like 2 Corinthians chapter 4, where, he says, on the one hand, uh, some were dying, and on the other hand, some are living. How does that work?
Death is working in us,
Death is
but
working
life
in
in
us,
you.
but life in you.
Yeah.
How does that work? And which one of those groups would you want to be in if that's physical death?
Yeah, Zach Davis and I were talking about this very passage the other day, and I said, if this is biological death, this doesn't work.
Right.
I'm sorry, it just simply doesn't work. Both groups are being persecuted. So if you're talking about biological death, that doesn't work. Some weren't dying and some weren't living. They were all subject to death.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's just simply biological death, it doesn't work because Paul says death is working in us, but it's not working in you. Well, yeah, it's working in them if it's physical death.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be some kind of a covenantal, transitional relevance and context to this as he goes back in chapter 3 and says, we are all being transformed from glory to glory. They're being translated from the covenant of death the ministration of death, written engraven in stones, to the ministry of life. And he uses the present active indicative. We are being transformed from glory to glory. So
Now,
that was at work there in 2 Corinthians chapter 4.
well, I don't know how you understand the text, but here's what I think about it in terms of what he's saying when he says death is working in us, but life in you. I don't take that as necessarily the persecution of the apostles. Some do,
Mm-hmm.
and they would see that, but there were members of the body of Christ who were being persecuted and killed as well. But what I see in the text is he's dealing with the fact that here are the Jews who were keeping the law, who were required to keep it, and they are dying to it. But the Gentiles were never brought under it, as Peter tells them in Acts chapter 15. And then he tells the Jews, but we believe that we shall be saved even as they, without coming under the yoke of the law. So here were the Gentiles coming in, and they were in the covenant by grace through faith without having to be under the law and dying to the law. Now, that's my concept. I'm just curious. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I I don't have a problem at all with that, because there was most assuredly, and this gets back to this two covenants at the same time, two systems, if you please,
Hmm.
because the Gentiles were never under the law.
Right.
They had no obligation to the law.
Hmm.
So Peter and James at the Jerusalem councils, in Acts chapter 15, Acts chapter 21, could say to the Gentiles concerning the keeping of the law and what have you, now concerning this matter, we thus judge the Gentiles have no part, no part in this. This has nothing to do with the Gentiles. This is all about Jews. So you do have two realities going on in the first century. And so what you're saying there, as I'm listening to you, is death is working in us Jews as we die to the law. Okay. But life in you, because you're never under the law, you're not dying to the law, but you are coming to life in Christ.
And then later on, he says, but God shall raise both of us up and present us with you. So he shows what the end game is, that they'll both be gathered together in the one body in the time of the consummation, when that process of dying, as you mentioned before in 2 Corinthians 3, that transformation from glory to glory for Israel would bring them into that Torah free gospel completely, in a consummated way, um, in the time of the end. The very same end we're talking about here. It's like, somebody, I have to laugh. Someone sent me that video from, what's the TV station? It's right down the street from me, where,
Oh,
uh, what's the name of it? I can't think of it. I'll think of it in a minute.
yeah. I may not be thinking the one that you are. Anyway,
Yeah, it's
something,
right there
something,
in
something,
Olive Branch.
something gospel, right?
Yeah, it's something gospel. But anyway, where the guy over at the School of Preaching, when he was talking about Matthew 24, and he's trying to separate the coming of Christ in 70 AD from his alleged future coming, he said, well, this is the end, but it's not the end.
Uh,
Oh, that was funny. So someone sent me that video because I had sent them a video on Revelation 1:7, and so that was their response back to me, at least to the people that sent it to them, and they wanted to tell them, well, here's your refutation here, but I got such a big kick out of that. This is the end, but it's not the end.
yeah. Well, yeah, well, I won't go into it, but I was just simply starting to say they're ascribing to the idea that AD 70 had to be a typological foreshadowing of the real end.
Yeah,
And, I was hearing that so much that I wrote that. That's one of the reasons I wrote that book that I
yeah,
did.
excellent book too.
Well, thank you. But AD 70, a shadow of the parentheses real parentheses in question mark.
Hmm.
Uh, you just It's just another example of people being so desperate to hang on to a futurist eschatology that they literally make this stuff up. And you're going, that's not what these texts are saying. And I'll never forget on one occasion, before I got terminated here at the Maxwell Avenue congregation, a young man came up to me after one of my presentations during class. Now, this was during a period of time, if I remember correctly, I began teaching a class on Revelation. And we started out with 100 people maybe in the class on Sunday, Sunday nights. And before you know it, it had grown to 200. And it grew all the way up to 335 or 40 people on a Sunday night,
Hmm.
for crying out loud. And that's when the elders started saying, well, we got to do something about this. We can't have this, you know. Yeah, you don't want all these people interested like this. But anyway, this young guy, he came up to me and he says, you present a pretty convincing case here, but he said, I think you're missing something. And I said, well, okay, what is that? He said, well, you're failing to see that AD 70 was a type and a shadow
Mm.
of the real end, the end of time. I said, okay, can you show me that in the book? Can you show me a text that said this foreshadows that? I said, now I know that the old covenant foreshadowed the new covenant, but can you show me where the new covenant foreshadows the end of the new covenant? And he just stood there a moment and he goes, I guess I'm going to have to look for that. He never found it and became a full preterist.
Yeah.
So, you know, but that's what happens. People try to hang on desperately, literally desperately, uh, to what we've been taught. And all of us understand that to a certain extent.
Hmm.
Uh, but when you begin to see this cumulative evidence that is just mounting up, mounting up, mounting up, and it becomes just really basically an overwhelming flood, it's like, what am I fighting for? You know, one person said, well, you're stripping me of my salvation. I said, well, wait a minute. How am I stripping you of your salvation? What I'm telling you is that now, when you die, you get to go to heaven. I said, can you tell me how that's a bad thing? And he goes, well, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I said, well, then how am I stripping you of anything? I said, isn't the ultimate goal of the Christian to live with God in heaven? He said, well, yeah. I said, okay, let me ask you this further question. I said, if when we die, and this person believed that as a member of the Church of Christ, he told me he believed that. I said, okay, if the faithful Christian dies and they go to heaven, did they need a body to go to heaven? Well, no. I said, okay, then tell me why, if when I die, I go to heaven and I'm with the Lord in fellowship, why do I one day need to leave heaven where I was to go back to get a body that I didn't need to be in heaven, grab that body, and then go back to heaven where I was in the first place? And
Interesting.
he just stood there and he goes, never thought about it like that. And I said, well, that's exactly what our brethren are saying, though.
Yeah, that's true.
At least those who say we go to heaven when we die. I said, I just don't understand that philosophy. And I taught it for years, but I don't understand it anymore. That's the dog wagging the tail, or tail wagging the dog, or something like that. It just does not make sense to me anymore. Okay,
N-
go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna, when you told your story, I didn't realize that you had a story like that when you taught the Book of Revelation.
Oh
When
yeah.
I first became a Christian, I think it was after about 6 months. Um, After I think maybe the first of, I'd say about the third Bible class I had attended, I was so impressed with our Bible school teacher. I was teaching Wednesday night Bible class that I asked him. I said, "How did you get all this knowledge about the Bible?" Because I knew absolutely nothing. And he told me, he says, well, because he was using C.R. Nichols' book at the time.
Ah, yeah.
And he said, well, I use this book. He said, you can, uh, you know, take a look at it. So I started reading it and I was learning things that I didn't know. And I said, well, where'd you get it from? He said, from I think it was the Gospel Advocate bookstore. I said, okay, well, I was getting paid every 2 weeks back then. So every 2 weeks I would go to that bookstore and I'd buy me 3 or 4 books. And one of the books that I bought was for Wallace's commentary and the copy of Josephus. And so I started reading his information on the book of Revelation and talking about the dating of the book. So I said, okay, this makes a whole lot of sense. So I asked if I could teach a class on just the dating
Ah.
of the book. I said, because it will determine how to interpret the book of Revelation. You know, everybody was talking about the mark of the beast and all this kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And so I started teaching. I don't know how long your class lasted. Mine didn't last that long. I started teaching, and we started off with about 30 people in Wednesday night Bible class. Well, by the next class, we had 68. And that's where Joy and I, you know, the lady we talked about before,
Right.
really connected. Because one of the elders came up after that class, and this class was, you know, it had doubled. People were totally interested. And he said, well, I don't think anybody wants to hear this. And he shut the class down at that moment. And it was at that point, after he had said that, Joy kind of popped up out of her seat like a jack in the box. And she says, well, I'm interested in hearing it. And a couple of other people, you know, started nodding their heads and saying yes. But he shut that class down at that point. And that was the end of that. But that's how we kind of connected and continued to study. And so I thought it was an interesting story that both of us had a similar story on the
Yeah.
same book with the elders, you know, wanting to shut the information down.
Yeah, let me expand on my story just a little bit. As I said, you know, on Sunday mornings, we were averaging a little over 400 people. But
Mm,
you know how that goes in most churches of Christ. Sunday nights, you're down to 150,
yeah.
you know, whatever. So the elders asked me to teach a class on Revelation. Okay, that's fine. And I began, just like you did, addressing the dating of the book because I told them, just like you did, if we do not have a proper dating, then we don't have a framework. We don't have a context in which to put the book of Revelation. And you can just see people going, well, that makes sense. Never thought about that before. Yeah, blah, blah. Okay. Over a period of weeks, this class literally just started exploding.
Mm,
And we had a few people that went to the elders and said, you're going to have to put a stop to this because Preston's causing people to raise a lot of questions that we're not comfortable with. And the elders didn't do much about it. They came to me on one occasion. They called me in and said, Don, we're not sure what you're doing on the class of Revelation. I said, what do you mean? What are you trying to do? And I said, I'm trying to teach the book of Revelation. I said, you asked me to do it. And I said, I'm trying to set the stage, set the context. Well, yeah, but you got a lot of people asking questions. I said, yeah, isn't it great? I said, brethren, isn't that what we want people to do? Well, hum, hog, hum, hog, hum. Well, okay, go ahead. Okay. So the class reached, as I mentioned a moment ago, over 335 people, 350. It was approaching 400. On a Sunday night, we had people literally driving 100 miles
mm,
one way to attend this class. Well, these, may I just use the term, traditionalists who had never thought past their nose when it came to the dating and application of the book of Revelation. All they knew is what they had been told. Went to the elders again. And the elder said, well, Don, we're going to have to ask you not to continue this class. And I said, what? Why? And once again, they said, well, we just got too many people asking questions. I said, brethren, what is wrong with people asking questions? Isn't that how we learn? And by the way, William, I wasn't even approaching it anywhere near dogmatically. I wasn't saying, now this is it, and that's why we're wrong. I said, here is the evidence for the late date. Here's the evidence for the early date. Make up your own mind. And because they were seeing both sides, people were just readily taking the early date. Well, some people didn't like that. So anyway, they approached me one Sunday night afterwards, and they said, we're going to have to put a stop to the class, Don. And I said, tell me why. Same story, same song. And I said, brother, look, I've never heard of somebody shutting a class down because there's too much interest in it. And that's exactly what you're doing. And and this one elder said, well, I tell you what, what we'll do is we'll have a meeting and we'll determine how you can proceed. I said, okay, that's fine. I said, let me know. one of the one of the elders who was a 99% preterist, but just didn't have the guts to go all the way.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to be unkind, but anyway, he called me to his house. He said, well, Don, here's what we've decided. I said, okay, I won't call his name. Nice guy. We've decided that you can go ahead and teach the book of Revelation, except the parts, I'm not kidding, except the parts that deal with eschatology. And I said, excuse me? He said, well, here's what we want you to do. We want you to go ahead and teach the book of Revelation uh, on the letters to the seven churches, because I'm not exaggerating, because they don't deal with eschatology.
Whoa.
And I said, I called his name and I said, would you pick up your Bible? He did. I said, would you turn to, I just called off the letters.
Mm-hmm.
I said, would you read the following verses? Until I come. Behold, I come quickly. Until I come. I said, so tell me how I'm supposed to teach about Revelation and the letters to the seven churches without mentioning eschatology, without mentioning the coming of the Lord. And he read it and he read it and he just looked up and he said, we didn't think that through very well, did we? I said, nope, you sure didn't. I said, so you tell me what I'm supposed to do. He said, you carry on until we let you know. So I carried on, and within 2 weeks, they just shut it completely down.
Wow.
Yeah. They just couldn't have all that many people interested in what the book of Revelation is all about. You just can't have people interested in the Bible like that.
Yeah, there were basically two things that they didn't want you to teach. That was Matthew chapter 24 and the book of Revelation.
Yeah, that's about right. So anyway, now folks, next week what we want to get into is the writer of Hebrews chapter 9 verse 10 says the old law was imposed until the time of Reformation. This to me, and we'll get into the linguistics of it, the time of Reformation being the diorthosis. That's the Greek word translated as Reformation. I believe you're going to see some really, really, really eye-opening things. In the meantime, William, great to be with you again. Great show. Appreciate the thoughts. And with that, I will say good night and God bless.
All right. Good night.
Okay. By the way, William, Jan and I are going back to Australia. I think it's the last 2 weeks of March. So if you could maybe get with Larry and do the program on those 2 weeks.
Okay.
You
I have to go. I'm going to Raymond's graduation. You know, Leora and I have put him through college.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he graduated and he is begging me to come.
Uh-huh.
So unless I just can't get a flight, that's where I more than likely will be. And
Okay.
it's the well, actually we're looking for a cheap flight, so If we can find one, I don't know what the exact dates, but it's going to hit somewhere within that very time frame.
Okay, well, that's understandable for sure. I mean, you got to attend that, man.
Yeah.
You got to do that. Um, but you don't have those dates nailed down, or would you
Well,
be gone for
the
two
date
weeks?
of his graduation is the 29th and the 30th,
Okay,
but I don't have the flight time,
right.
and
I
so
got you.
I don't want to just fly, and because I've got congregations in two regions that they want me to come and teach them.
Cool.
So I was going to make it a little bit extended stay. I'm not sure how
Okay.
long. It depends on what I can do with the flights.
Okay. Well, I will contact Larry then and see about him filling in for me.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's fine. That's not a
And
problem.
if for some reason I don't get some flights, I'll just let you know, and then I'll be here.
Okay, that's fine. But I will not count on it. But you because you like I said, you need to attend that for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he's really counting on us being there.
I will. I don't blame him a bit, and that's great. You're to be commended for that. Okay, well, we'll talk at you a little bit later, and we'll see you next week.
Okay. Take care.
Good night.
Good night.